Welcome again to our Deeper Life Studies. And thank you for those that have responded in one way or another and indicated their appreciation for the study. It's made me think a lot and deeply. We're in a situation, sadly, in our world today where abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, bullying, sexual abuse, even of minors, is becoming more and more prevalent, or it's coming to the surface. And that means we have to deal with it. Obviously, we deal with it as far as legally. Obviously, that is the case. But also, we have a lot of people that we meet who will confess openly that they are damaged. And some people would feel, and they themselves, the victims, often feel they're damaged beyond repair. I've had quite a bit of experience, and it's rather harrowing for the counsellor as it is for the counsellee. The compassion that I feel when dealing with people that have been horribly abused is overwhelming. To hear the story, and not just the story, but the pang, the ache, the agony that comes through in sharing the pain and the circumstance, the situation that they have had to experience. Not had to because it was the choice of someone else and they just succumbed or had to yield to it because of perhaps threats of violence, further violence, threats of exposure, all kinds of things. We're talking in our studies not so much about the problem because we're faced with that every day. What we're looking for are the keys, not to just survival, but to overcoming and being healed and being brought back to normality. Is it at all possible? Well, many a psychiatrist will tell you it's a tall order. They will tell you that it's very hard to even be able to get to the first steps of bringing about a recovery. What are the first steps? Well, you must engender trust. And this is something that has been robbed from the victim. The ability to trust somebody. We're going to talk about 3 types of abuse today, and we're going to go into the Bible itself. The ancient scriptures talk about practical things, not just as some people would think, the ethereal, the spiritual, but very, very definite principles are laid out in the scripture. And when we look at them, we realize that therein are the keys to recovery and to healing. Why don't we go back to Genesis chapter 16? Genesis means beginnings, and one of the first instances of abuse was at the hands of Sarai, and we talked about this perhaps even a little clumsily in our last session or the session before that. This is a tremendous situation. You see, Hagar is the one that was very, very cruelly treated. And you find often that in Hagar's hurt, she was an innocent victim of both circumstances and the folly of other people. Most, if not all, of those that are abused are the innocent victim of circumstances and a situation. Their circumstances make them alienated from notice from those that they are family or friends, and they become isolated for one reason or another. Now, Hagar was isolated in the home and in the circle of Abraham and Sarai, or Abram as he was known then, and Sarai. She was a servant girl. while they were in Egypt and returning from Egypt, they took with them Hagar as an Egyptian servant girl. She lived, she existed to satisfy the every whim of Sarai in particular. And so she was a slave girl. That's all that she was called to be. And when it was found that Sarai was not conceiving and not bearing a child, she took the initiative and said to Abram, well, take my servant girl and have sex with her, and who knows, she may conceive and give you that son and heir that you desire so much. And that was the circumstance. The Bible doesn't recall at all that Hagar was anything more than the victim of this situation. The circumstances around her brought her to a place where she just submitted and succumbed. And when she fell pregnant to Abram, and it would seem pretty soon that Sarai began then to take exception to her. Now, the Bible says that suddenly it became very much the awareness of Hagar that she was now possibly in conceiving and bearing the child, the number one wife. And Sarai was seen as secondary and infirm in that she could not produce the heir. All kinds of things are there to be considered. We have a number of victims that we talk to and seek to help who feel that their circumstances were such that suddenly they became vulnerable, suddenly they were groomed, suddenly they became aware that they were being pursued by maybe a family member or somebody that had ascendancy over them, had control. I was talking just yesterday to someone who said to me, a victim of terrible abuse that went on for years, ruined a lady's life for over 50 years. She told me that it was a youth pastor that had cajoled, had groomed, and had smoothed everything over and gave her an excuse why she should succumb to his advances, which she did. And her telling comment was, well, he was a pastor and I trusted him. Now that is a very real problem, isn't it? And this was not only Hagar's situation. Abram was the head of the house. He was a man of great substance. He was a man of great wealth. He was respected in Egypt. And Hagar would have felt that there was privilege in being the servant to Sarai and the servant to Abram. But of course, it turned so ugly when she was asked to produce the heir. Now, another innocent victim of someone in authority was none other than Bathsheba. And there are two or three very important factors that we should take note of and be warned by. King David was, well, he was supposed to go, as kings do, to war. But the Bible says when kings go forth to war, David stayed in Jerusalem. He should have led his armies, we presume. He didn't. He stayed behind. There is no excuse given why that he would stay behind. But in those idle hours of the evening hours, he went out onto his terrace and he looks down on a neighboring house, a grace and favor apartment, if you will, a place that was occupied by Uriah and his wife Bathsheba. And as David walked on the terrace of his house and looked down on this lower dwelling, he could see that Bathsheba was bathing, a beautiful, voluptuous, desirable woman. And it wasn't as though David didn't have wives of his own, but as he gazed upon her, he had something, a weapon, that so many in authority do. They have power through position. This lady I told you about just minutes ago told me that she felt obligated to succumb. She was only 12 years old when that youth leader, youth pastor, we would say today, made overtures to her. He would have been probably 14 years older than her, or 12 years older than her. He was an adult. He was in a position of trust within the church. He had persuasive ways. He was a fine-looking man, and he had a personality that had won the affection and also the trust of so many, including this young woman. King David was beloved from all over Israel. He was the acknowledged king. It wasn't like Saul, who had gone before him. He was loved. He was honored. He was almost worshipped as God's instrumentality. So when Bathsheba was called into the king's palace, without thinking, she obeyed, as you would when you are called and summoned by the sovereign. And what happened then was obvious, that he seduced her, and she succumbed, and whatever was in her heart and whatever was in her mind and the distress that that would have caused was secondary to the fact that he was usurping his authority, because he had the authority as the king of Israel over this woman who was married to a servant, now out on active duty and away from the home. This is the confusion that comes into people's minds. They feel that they must obey, they must yield because of the authority their abuser has. And that's where amazing things happen. Now, I say amazing because God has formed the rules, if you like, of morality, the framework of morality, the law of God. The law of morality is to safeguard all of us from sin. Now, in the last pages of the book of Ecclesiastes, there is an ominous scripture, an ominous one. It says these words: "He that breaks down the hedge." Now, the word hedge is made or used in the King James Version. The New King James says, "He that breaks down a fence, a serpent will bite him." In other words, breaking down the moral fiber and disregarding moral principles that God has ordained will bring all kinds of trouble. When we read the story of David and Bathsheba, we are amazed that almost immediately the house of David is assaulted, undermined, and attacked by all kinds of upheaval. After David breaks down that wall, his household is never the same. He has problems with Absalom. He has a devastating situation with his son Amnon and Tamar, who is raped by this son. So incest is just rampant in the home. And Absalom becomes an enemy and even seeks to overthrow his father. Later on, Adonijah is the same, who tries to, in the dying days of King David, tries to become the king of Israel. Terrible upheavals. David's judgment is impaired. He numbers Israel, and of course a judgment comes. All kinds of upheavals. And that causes me to sit back and think, when we violate principles of morality, spiritual principles as well, any form of principle, we leave ourselves open to the intervention of the enemy. And I think it's significant in Ecclesiastes when it says, he that breaks down a wall, he that breaks down a fence, he that breaks down the hedge, a serpent will bite him. I think many people, when they turn their back on the principles, the commandments that God has ordained and plainly given to all of us for our safeguarding, when we break down and repudiate and turn our back and rebel against that, we are asking for an inflow of darkness. And it certainly happened in David's life, his family, and in the nation. Terrible things happen. And of course, we know also about Tamar. Let's talk about Tamar. Incest in the home. A half-brother has fallen in love. Well, has he fallen in love, or is he just motivated by overwhelming lust? Terrible thing. He just desires Tamar above anything and above everything. And so he desires to have her and to seduce her. And he has a friend who says to him, well, you can have her. You're the king's son. Why don't you pretend that you're sick? Work on her sensitivity. Work on her sympathy. And ask your father to send her that she might feed you, that she might concoct a meal and then come over to your part of the palace, and then you can have her. And that's exactly what happened. You know, an abuser will know his victim as stealthily as a snake slithering through the grass and looking and being very, very aware of his prey. He watches for a vulnerable moment. He knows his prey. And the abuser gets to know, sometimes I think supernaturally, they know the inner working of the mind and the nature of the person, and then at a time that is convenient, they strike. And that's exactly what Amnon did to Tamar. One of the worst things when dealing with a victim is that they often will take on overwhelming guilt and certainly shame. And that drives them underground. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to confess it. They don't want to say anything. And funnily enough, they'll defend the abuser, especially if that abuser is maybe a member of their family that they've always loved. And they're willing to dismiss this overwhelming crime of incest and abuse as being, oh, well, a mistake was made and I forgive. I had an experience over 40 years ago when I was pastoring in Melbourne. I had a lady who rang me. We knew the family well. As you may or you may not know, my wife and I ministered for many, many years in children's conventions, in children's camps, many churches or combined churches or even state churches combined together and at a campground would every year have Christian camps. We went for, I think, 9 years straight to the Adelaide Hills, to a place, funnily enough, called Cuddly Creek. And the Assemblies of God in Australia and South Australia owned a prime piece of real estate there. And they had some simple huts and a meeting hall and a dining hall there. And we had wonderful, wonderful children's conventions. We had also Christmas camps, And we had Easter camps for the youth as well. I didn't minister at the Christmas camps nor at the youth camps, but every year I would go to Cuddly Creek, and hundreds of young children would come there, and we would have a remarkable program with a terrific staff of probably nearer to 60 if you counted the kitchen staff, the cooks, and then the counsellors and the workers. We had a wonderful, wonderful time. I may have exaggerated, might have been 40 that were there, but we had a marvellous time. Similarly, in Melbourne at the Beulah Heights camp, every September holidays, we had a week, and it was the children's camp. And for many, many years, my wife and I went there, and I was the key speaker on numerous occasions, taking a cereal every morning that left the kids high and wondering what was going to happen next as I dramatized the story. And then at night, it was purely spiritual. On a number of occasions in Melbourne, I saw this little boy and little girl. I suppose they were about 11 or 12, and they were very slender, European, beautiful blonde hair, blue-eyed, Western European children. And they had lovely singing voices, a lovely lilt in their voice. And as they sang, something troubled me, and I know it troubled my wife as well, because as we sat and watched and appreciated their gift of singing, they would cry. The tears would stream down their cheeks. And then at the time of prayer, when we prayed for children, that they'd come to Christ or come back to Christ, whatever the need, we would pray. They would be sobbing and almost be hysterical. It worried me. There was no need for that. We didn't whip children up into an emotional frenzy. Never. In fact, we're against that. And we would just tenderly and quietly, and I hope wisely, minister to children. And the children went back to their seats and then on to their beds at night with a great degree of peace, but not these children. They were constantly crying and fretting, and sometimes uncontrollably. Well, it worried me. But then, as I believe, as God would have it, the whole family came into our church in Melbourne. And as I was ministering to them, I would visit there because I was intrigued. What made that family tick? 5 beautiful children, fresh-faced, innocent children, and that's where I was wrong. I was totally wrong. They weren't innocent children. They were children that were being used and abused sexually by their father. A man that today could be tyrannical and drinking and violent verbally anyway, and I think physically, and taking a child, whether it was a boy or a girl, to the bed and doing whatever he chose to do. We didn't know that until over a year after they'd been coming to our church. His wife suddenly, when she saw her 12-year-old daughter being violated, she said to me, "Pastor, isn't there something you can do?" Well, I said, absolutely. And I said, it starts with the law. And I picked her up in the car and took her to the local police station, and a complaint was made. He was subsequently arrested. He went on trial and was given a remarkable sentence of leniency. But my concern and my burden was for the children and for his wife, who is alive today and from time to time contacts me. And every time, even though it's been 40 years, she will say in the conversation, and did so just a few months ago when she rang me, she said, "I will never forget what you did for us in stopping this terrible, hellish lifestyle that we lived, in getting my husband arrested." Well, it was the only thing we should and could do. But what about the children? Well, that was the amazing part. They exonerated their father. They didn't accept personal guilt. They knew exactly that he had set upon them and done what he did to them, but they would have no criticism. In fact, the girl, who was now about 19, when we were going to court on the day of his trial, the father's trial, she said to me, "I will never forgive you, Pastor Hallo, if my father goes to jail." Now, her mother, the wife of the predator, didn't feel that way. She was so bamboozled, she was so crushed, she was so absolutely controlled by this man, she didn't know what to say. In fact, he had absolutely gutted her. And while you may say as a parent, "Oh, I wouldn't have stood for that," she was a very young mother when he started, and he controlled and was ruthless with her, threatened her, and threatened the children. She had just become a robot. So I never ever did condemn her, even though she knew what was going on. She did go to a number of pastors seeking help, and 3 pastors said, in varying degrees, "Oh, we'll let God work that one out," or "I don't know what to do," or "Oh, we'll pray about it." Well, I couldn't do that. I believe God has put, according to Romans chapter 13, the legal system into place, and they are God's ministers for justice. And that's why I took her without question. The very first day I heard of what had gone on, I took her to the police. But what of the children? They had become so warped and so overladen with what had happened and so confused, it took years for them to be healed. The young girl that turned on me said, "If Pastor Hallo, my father today is condemned to prison, he will hang himself and I will hold you responsible." I was driving at the time when she said that. I nearly went up the back of a tram. I got such a shock at what she was saying. I was looking in the rear vision mirror at her, trying to work out, was this some sort of joke? What was she saying? And I was trying to analyze what she was saying. But thankfully, over a period of time, she realized the enormity of the damage that had been done to her and her siblings. The wife regained some dignity, some strength, and subsequently and consequently divorced her husband, and later on in life married a very wonderful man, and has just been widowed recently and had many happy years with that man. A stable life, a restored life. The children, well, I'm sad to say the young son, who at the time was about 16, he had been violated and abused, and he himself became an abuser and lost his marriage. And of course, his children don't want anything to do with him. Tragedy indeed. I haven't lost contact with some of those children. They're often in contact with me through social media. But the warp, the wound that comes, and what we've got to realize when we're dealing with a victim is to say to the victim, who was the person that violated you? Who was the one that took your innocency? Who was the one that brutalized you? And if you find that they were in a place of authority, you've got a real battle on your hands, because they believe sometimes in their warped outlook that that person had the right to offend as they did. Bathsheba, had she explained what had happened, would have said, well, he was the king. Hagar would have said, well, he was my master. He was my mistress's husband. I couldn't exist without him. And many times a perpetrator will sow into the mind, sow into the heart, that I am the authority over your life. You will do what I say. And oftentimes that comes with a threat that if you tell anybody, if you go to the police, if you go to anybody, your mother or whoever, and tell what I've been doing, I will make it so bad for you. You see, they maintain this control, they maintain this bullying, but it's brutalizing and it's taking away the dignity, the individuality of that person they've victimized. What are the steps that we take? Well, I'm only going to give you one and then we'll come back and talk about it further. You are the one that they have come to, either voluntarily. You are the one that happens to, in life, cross their paths, and somehow, some way, they've confided in you. This is important because that proves that they have some measure of trust and maybe even affection for you. You know, trust is so important. People trust you. Never betray that trust. What's the second thing that you must always remember? You tell them that you are committed to them and that anything that they tell you is in strictest confidence. You're not going to blab to people. You're not going to suddenly take up their cause. You're not going to portray them even as a victim that requires pity. You're going to stand with them and be with them. And in the course of time, you can say to them, I think we need to go and speak to someone professional. There are psychiatrists, there are counselors that have got tremendous ability, skill, and training in this area. People of great compassion, great understanding, great wisdom, people who are able to take them by the hand, as it were, and step by step take them beyond where you have been. But they'll always need your friendship. They will always need your love. They will always need to know that in the midnight hour, when they have a night terror, something comes to them. They hear a sound. They feel the old fears rising up within. They'll need to know that you're there. Trust is so important. You know, you can love somebody, but not trust them because they are frail, because they maybe are emotional and they just blab everything, sometimes with good intentions. But be the person that maintains trust because they're going to need you from the first day they open up and begin to disclose that they have a problem. They have a secret. Often they will say that, you know, I have a secret. Someone will say, if you really knew me, if you knew what I've been through, you may not want to be my friend. And this is a way of saying, I'm going to test whether this person will still love me, still want me, still care for me. I felt very sad yesterday when I was talking to the friend that I mentioned right at the outset of our time together today, because she was telling me that because a relative of hers who was also involved with this predator that she was a victim of, she never told her husband, never ever mentioned it to him. And then one day, well into their marriage, she brought it up. And you know, that was something the husband could not cope with. And it was really one of the main reasons why the marriage failed. He said to her these words, and what other secrets have you kept from me? So it is so essential to be able to maintain a relationship where a victim feels trust and is able to talk to you freely. And not only about the issue and the problem and the wound and the hurt and the pain and the crime, but they're able to talk to you about anything, because you'll find that their value system is so broken. Their value system is so out of joint. They don't know what to believe about so many things. They will have so many distortions in their outlook about God, their outlook about love, their outlook about marriage, their outlook about children, their outlook about even the crime itself. We'll talk further about these things later on, the next time we're together. God bless you. And if you have a problem, if this is all too real and raw to you and painful, and you think, well, I've never had anyone to talk to, you can notify me by email, and I would love the privilege of sharing with you and listening to your story at any time. Whether you're here in Australia or overseas, our programs go right around the world, and this is a universal problem. It is known and experienced in every nation of the world. Some religions use abuse as a badge of privilege. Can you imagine anything more ugly than that? Anyway, for the time being, I'll look forward to seeing you, and do confide with us, knowing that it's confidential, and knowing also that we really do care. And we can also put you in contact with professional help so that you get the very best, if that is your desire. God bless you. See you again next time.